Hi, it's time to begin, and a moment prior to this, I received notice that my co-presenter cannot make it. I assure you it's for a good reason, and he is a quality person, but it'll just be me. So there'll be a few portions where I will be playing both roles, and I hope my high school theater classes pay dividends in that respect. So, hi everyone, welcome to the Drupal 10 Modernizing JavaScript and Removing jQuery session. Just a moment here. This may be the most awkward of the slides. I'm going to introduce you to the presenters. So I'm Ben, and I'm an engineer for the Drupal acceleration team at Acquia. I've worked on nearly all the issues we'll be discussing today, and in some cases, I'm the only person who's worked on them. And also with me in spirit, and he's a Drupal core JavaScript maintainer who's been working with Drupal JavaScript far longer than I have, and has provided invaluable feedback on the issues I'm working on. I was hoping he'd be here when I get things wrong, but he'll just do that later. Now, I want to make a huge disclaimer. Amazing, exciting things are being built with JavaScript. Initiatives such as Drupal decoupled menus are evidence of this. This session is not really about that exciting stuff. It's more about addressing JavaScript dependencies that are outdated, end of life, or abandoned. Very few of the modernizing efforts being discussed today will result in noticeably different Drupal user experience, but it will be a very different developer experience. Addressing these aging JavaScript dependencies will make it easier for Drupal to adopt more exciting JavaScript functionality in Drupal 10 and beyond. So I'm going to be throwing a ton of info at you, and I think there are some takeaways that are more important than any of the specifics I'll be providing. The fact that there is a ton of information is one of the most important things to be aware of. I hope it's apparent that removing these dependencies resembles surgery more than it does replacing a sofa. I also want to use this to communicate just how much work has been done already. This work is very far under the hood, so there may not be full awareness of what has been happening. Honestly, if I was still at an agency instead of the Drupal acceleration team, I'd probably have zero idea this was happening. The efforts I'll be discussing started almost 2 years ago, and a significant amount has happened very quietly. Finally, for each of the issues we discuss, I want to remind everyone that the community is invited to get involved. An enormous amount of work is being done by a relatively small amount of contributors. I'm not concerned about who's doing the work as much as I'd like to be sure the community is happy with what's going on. And the URL on the upper right of each slide will take you to a gist listing every issue we'll be discussing. If you have concerns, let those issues know. We'll be reading. So I want to start with an overview of what goes into modernizing an old library. It wasn't that long ago that I was someone that rolled my eyes and wondered why Drupal didn't just add various cool new things. After doing this work, I take back every eye roll. Most of us are aware that the switch from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 was pretty intense. Part of the reason for that switch was creating a Drupal that accommodates upgrades more gracefully, as evidenced by the relative ease of upgrading from 8 to 9 versus any prior upgrade. This approach to Graceful Updates includes a Graceful Update for JavaScript libraries. We're not going to present breaking changes in a minor update, and sites need to be adequately warned for changes that will happen in future major releases. If we switch to a new library, it's necessary for it to be backwards compatible with its predecessor's API for the entirety of that Drupal major version. We provide shims that allow the old API surface to continue working and provide deprecation warnings so developers have adequate time to prepare for Drupal 10. And my dog's growling at the mailman. Easy, girl. All right. For example, if jQuery UI autocomplete has a response event that's triggered, that event will work the same way for the rest of Drupal 9, even if jQuery UI autocomplete has been fully removed from Drupal. Similarly, it has to be possible to get markup identical to that provided by the removed JavaScript library. Themes that subtheme stable 9 are promised markup that won't change. Sometimes this means having to conditionally modify a new library to work with the old library's markup structure, since different DOM elements are in use, and it's hard. If at all possible, module maintainers should not have to have different versions of their modules to support an old library and a new library at the same time, and that's an additional complication. And finally, and also since IE11 is supported for the rest of Drupal 9, many of the modern replacements we're introducing require additional polyfills. Fortunately, there's been a good polyfill available for everything we've needed so far. So the Drupal 10 JS modernization can be split into 4 main categories. First, there's jQuery UI, which is end of life and it's been untouched for 4 years. This really needs to land by 9.3 alpha, which will be the week of October 25th, 2021. Or there's a risk of delaying the release of Drupal 10. The next is libraries depending on jQuery. While this isn't as urgent as jQuery UI, not getting this in by 9.3 could create some very unpleasant technical debt down the road. More on that later. After that is Backbone. It's not technically end of life, but it's also minimally maintained, and removing it is a highly recommended precaution. This would be nice to get in by 9.3 as well, but that may not be feasible due to QuickEdit's complexity, and it may be possible to approach this removal a little differently. And finally, there's jQuery. This is much less urgent than the other items because jQuery is likely going to be around for a while. That said, it'd be nice to push the needle forward on this sooner than later. More on how we're hoping to tackle this in a bit. So jQuery UI is easily our top priority. It's end of life, and the OpenJS Foundation classifies it as an Demetrius project. Of particular concern is if jQuery 4 is released and there are jQuery UI components that don't work with it. Work on removing jQuery UI started in fall 2019, and everything listed here is deprecated. Position and resizable are deprecated but not crossed out, as they're indirectly used by the 2 parts of jQuery UI that do not yet have replacements in core. jQueryUIDialog and autocomplete are the last widgets standing. We're hard at work creating their replacements, but both of these are heavily integrated with Drupal in a way that makes graceful replacement difficult. Let's start with autocomplete. We initially looked into a replacement library that, we initially looked into replacement libraries until realizing that the level of customization needed to integrate any of them with Drupal was high enough that we were better off just writing our own autocomplete. So we created our own autocomplete, which will eventually be available as a standalone library that can be used by any site, Drupal or otherwise. This autocomplete happened to include several excellent accessibility improvements, so we're calling it A1Y autocomplete. We then had to create a backwards compatible shim so any sites using jQuery UI autocomplete functions would not suddenly break. This translates every function, option, and event from jQuery UI autocomplete to the new Drupal core autocomplete. But doing so triggers a deprecation warning for sites to switch to the new autocomplete API before Drupal 10. To ensure this backwards compatibility layer was doing what it promised, we also created core Nightwatch versions of every autocomplete test bundle with jQuery UI. So that's almost 2,500 lines of tests written for jQuery UI autocomplete that pass with both jQuery UI autocomplete and the shimmed A1Y autocomplete. But there's still work to be done. A1Y autocomplete needs to be moved to a separate package. We also need to address the jQuery UI dependency on position, something that's not needed for our new library, but it's needed for our backwards compatible promise. And finally, this needs extensive review. This is a look at the diff, it's huge, and it can't really be broken into smaller parts. So the more eyes on it, the better. Then there's jQueryUIDialog, which is easily the most integrated into Drupal core. Drupal's JavaScript really takes advantage of the jQuery UI feature set, and there's no library that comes close to offering that. In fact, the majority of dialog libraries we evaluated didn't even offer non-modal dialogues, something needed for off-campus. No good replacement existed. So we've created a custom dialog library that replicates the majority of jQueryUIDialog's features, but it's standalone vanilla JS and uses the native dialog element, and the API itself is similar enough that shimming requires only a dozen or so lines of code. We're excited to eventually provide this as a standalone library so sites can enjoy the features of jQueryUIDialog in a standalone library. This new dialog already works and passes all Drupal tests, but there's still some rough edges that need smoothing. Fortunately, we recently got confirmation from those guarding Drupal core gates that this is a good approach, so our efforts getting this cleaned up will be time well spent. So there is plenty of work ahead. The merge request has plenty of feedback that needs to be addressed. Similar to autocomplete, we need to address the dependency on jQuery UI position, something we've probably figured out, but the issue is not our TBC yet. And finally, we're going to need to port jQuery UI's dialog test to Nightwatch. So similar to autocomplete, we can be certain that the replacement is truly backwards compatible with its jQuery UI predecessor. And now for priority number 2, libraries that depend on jQuery. While none of these libraries have officially been declared as end of life, few of them seem to be actively maintained. In addition to the usual concerns that come with unmaintained libraries, there's an additional, potentially super annoying risk of jQuery 4 being released and these libraries no longer working. Fortunately, in most cases, there are better alternatives available, be it a new library or using previously unavailable native functionality. The first library I'm going to mention is one we already got rid of, jQuery once. The replacement library once, it's just once without the jQuery, was built by Theodore, who was going to be here, and several other Drupal contributors. It's standalone, it works great, and it's become the first Drupal JavaScript library available as a standalone NPM package and lives in the Drupal code GitLab repository. This is a huge deal in many ways. Among other things, this functionality can easily be used by non-Drupal sites. There's test coverage that doesn't require the full overhead of Drupal core tests. And A1Y autocomplete and dialog will be part of this suite of libraries eventually. And this library set that standard. The next library is jQueryUIDialog, which is used for Tour. We found a worthy replacement, Shepherd.js, which provides everything Joyride does, but with significantly better accessibility. However, the architecture is very different. To gracefully switch to Shepherd, I had to create a deprecation and backwards compatibility layer for the tooltip plugins themselves, a markup backwards compatibility layer that restructures markup depending on whether a tour is pre-existing or newly installed from an external module, and deprecating several properties from the tour schema itself. I honestly don't know how many custom tooltip plugins are out there, as most seem to use the default text tip. But if sites use them, you'll be pleased to know we went to insane lengths to ensure your plugins will work with Shepherd.js. The work on this is close to complete, and what remains is addressing some fairly specific review feedback. Next is the Farbtastic color picker library. In the years since Farbtastic was added, every supported browser other than IE11 supports native color pickers. We received UX sign-off that it's okay to present IE11 users with a message letting them know that they can either enter hex codes manually or switch to a different browser. There's already a working patch for this, but there are several additional steps needed before this is ready for review. Several of these additional steps are new contributor friendly, so there's an open invitation to jump in and help us remove this dinosaur. And finally, there's jQuery form. This doesn't seem quite as ignored as the other libraries I've mentioned, but it's still a library that depends on jQuery. This is integrated into core Ajax, and I'm not sure what extracting it would look like. I've linked to an issue where we're exploring how to remove the jQuery dependency from Ajax overall, but everything regarding jQuery form is in the very early stages. I am happy to admit I do not know what to do yet. So priority 3 is Backbone. It's not actively maintained. Its use is very jQuery heavy, and it could be disrupted by jQuery 4. Very few developers are comfortable working with Backbone, and in many cases, it's adding unnecessary complexity to functionality that would otherwise be pretty easy to maintain. After quite a bit of research and prototyping, it was confirmed that this functionality can be moved to vanilla.js classes. There are 4 areas that will need to be de-backboned, and all but QuickEdit should be reasonably easy. The second most complex, contextual links, already has a working replacement that just needs some attention before it's review worthy. I also want to mention something that came up during the Backbone exploration process. View was one of the options explored, and I created working View prototypes for both tour and contextual links. I was quite impressed with Vue and its ability to coexist with non-Vue JavaScript. I'd only worked with React in the past and did not expect Vue to be so cooperative. I was also pleased to discover that framework managers and JavaScript maintainers were not opposed to exploring the addition of Vue to core. There's agreement that Vue and core is a different discussion than the one in 2017 that culminated in choosing React for the decoupled admin UI project. However, it was also clear that JavaScript classes worked fine, even if they weren't quite as elegant in the case of replacing Backbone. We couldn't justify adding a giant library to core when the vanilla.js version works just as well for replacing Backbone, but just a little uglier. So Vue and core is a possibility if we can demonstrate how it would be used to improve core. This is different from past issues that argue simply for why Vue is a good framework. There needs to be evidence of how it would specifically benefit Drupal. I've opened an issue for that, and despite a good amount of followers, there hasn't been any activity. Just know that Vue and core is a discussion that can happen. if we can document some great possible uses for it. So, and that aside, priority number 4, removing jQuery. This is less urgent because jQuery is definitely going to be around for a while longer, and we're not entirely sure how to approach this yet, and welcome everyone's input. One significant thing discovered during this exploration is that jQuery is actually pretty darn good at several things that don't necessarily have simple alternatives, particularly when working with legacy code. There's a bit more nuance than the vanilla bros would believe. A big one is jQuery event handling. We can't simply switch to vanilla event handling as there's a need to handle event delegation. I prototyped with 2 different delegation libraries that seem quite good, including the delegated events library that GitHub used when they removed jQuery. Neither of these could work as a drop-in replacement due to Drupal's enthusiastic use of the full feature set of jQuery UI's event handling. Core event handling would need to be extensively refactored before either of these libraries could be used. There is a newer library that we've not yet researched called Cache, which can be used for replacing much of jQuery's functionality. It's less established, so we need to make sure it would pass a dependency evaluation and also ensure that it doesn't introduce more complexities than simply staying with jQuery. There are countless other jQuery functions and selectors that I realized had been taken for granted. In an issue where I removed table drags jQuery dependency, I had to create several utility functions for jQuery functionality that did not have direct vanilla equivalents. It was also clear that these utility functions should be available to all of Drupal, not just table drag. A potential approach to making no jQuery utility functions was proposed in the issue linked here and in the gist in the upper right. This would create a global Drupal utils resource that would provide vanilla versions of jQuery functionality we've come to expect, and it could be used to shim jQuery if the time came to remove it. But that approach raised a very good question. How much of this effort would just be rewriting jQuery, a library that will be around for a little while longer? And in many cases, the vanilla versions have a larger file size than jQuery because jQuery has abstracted things incredibly efficiently. And if we replicate that efficiency, aren't we just writing jQuery? Basically, we don't know yet. So for now, I think a good place to start is introducing linting rules that check for various jQuery uses. At the beginning, most of these linting rules would be inactive. There'd be individual issues for turning each rule on and refactoring all jQuery that the linting rule looks for. This provides a fairly elegant way to phase out jQuery that can easily be phased out, and the linter can prevent those usages from being unintentionally added back. This approach provides a structured way to address low-hanging jQuery fruit, and would create a bunch of issues that I think would be pretty satisfying to work on. As these issues get resolved, all that will remain is the fruit. Based on what's left, we can then decide if the best option is new libraries, a smaller custom build of jQuery, because jQuery isn't 100% bad, or going with something entirely different that we haven't figured out yet. Getting this linting portion going will make the entire jQuery removal conversation much easier. I don't think it's that difficult to review either, so anybody eager to see this get moving, please jump in. So we've covered the 4 priorities, and I'd like to summarize them again. jQuery UI replacement needs to happen and could potentially delay Drupal 10's release if it doesn't. jQuery dependent libraries and backbone don't have to happen, but not doing so could result in very ugly technical debt down the road. For jQuery, unless we get a Spartacus moment, it's not feasible for it to go away in Drupal 10, but this is a great time to get things moving, and many of the tasks will probably be kind of fun for contributors. So that's the end of the formal presentation, and we'll take a few questions. I really wish Theodore, who knows JavaScript incredibly well, was here, but I will field these questions as best I can. Thank you. I'm going to check the Q&A tab here. Okay, so there's only one question at the moment I see. Can we create a fresh new Drupal 8.9 site without using jQuery? Unless you're running an incredibly bare bones site, you're gonna have some jQuery in it. I think the minimal install perhaps wouldn't have jQuery, but oh, link to the slides. Yeah, I'll take care of that. Oh yeah, but it's hard to imagine no jQuery being loaded, but you definitely don't have to add any of your own, and you can obviously write all your custom themes and modules using vanilla. No problem with that. And we have a core already supports a ton of really great polyfills. So you would not have to include those as well. All right. All right, I'm going to move to the next one. So what's the motivation to remove jQuery, not jQuery UI? So part of that is we're not even 100% sure if we're going to fully remove it. So that's part of the discussion. But in general, what we're hoping to do is reduce overall dependencies and be less susceptible to them updating. And so if we can get rid of jQuery in a manner that is not a disruptive developer experience, there'll be the overall file size of Drupal will be smaller, and we don't have to worry about jQuery updates disrupting things. And it can always be available as a contributed module. We just, if possible, want to reduce the overall number of dependencies for core itself. All right. And then I see, what about forking just the pieces of jQuery we need? And that's absolutely one of the things that we are interested in doing. And the linting issue that I mentioned is a great start to that. So at the moment, we pretty much need all of jQuery. I think there's one or two things that we don't need, but about 95% of it is currently used. But when I created the linting issue, there are several things that could be removed pretty easily, and we could significantly reduce how much jQuery is necessary and create a custom build of that. Wouldn't necessarily be a fork, but it would be a custom build. It'd still be great if jQuery takes care of maintaining jQuery. All right, and see another question saying in the chat, someone was asking about groups paying for this work. To the best of my knowledge, it's just Acquia, and I work for Acquia. And next year, yeah, if more people want to jump in, that'd be awesome. I'd love some pals. All right, and we see another question. With your experience working with tooltips replacement, not sure if anyone actually implemented this. Do you think it would make sense for some of our JS stuff to be less extensible in the future? And that is a big yes. One of the reasons that this is so difficult is the jQuery UI surface was essentially presented as a Drupal API. And so it creates this insanely complex backwards compatibility process. So for autocomplete, I had to write a shim that addressed hundreds of use cases, several of which I'm quite skeptical are actually being used, but also we'd be breaking the promise if not, and I don't want to find out the hard way that we broke the promise. So I do think reining in the APIs is important, and otherwise a lot of Drupal development is just going to be catch up when libraries reach end of life. Let me see, I'm losing track here. Oh, I see. Okay, there's a question about, Greg says, my experience with QuickEdit, it's not great. Is it worth replacing if CKEditor 5 has similar improvements? So while that isn't really in the, I happen to be working on CKEditor 5 quite a bit, and it's an apples and oranges kind of thing. So say QuickEdit is still going to exist, and CKEditor 5 will be available as an in-place editor, but the mechanism in which you would be able to edit fields the way QuickEdit would still be responsible for editing fields. on a front end page when you're viewing it. On the other hand, as a result of working on some of the CK editor, we are spotting some imperfections in QuickEdit that may improve the overall experience once CK editor 5 becomes available, regardless of the editor you're using. Let's see. Oh, yeah, and it says, is pulling these new standalone libraries such as once into existing Drupal 8 sites doable? Absolutely. Yep. So it's available as an NPM package. You can choose to add it that way. But there's definitely no compatibility issues. And you could, as far as adding it as a library, you can make things easier by referencing core libraries YML in Drupal 9. Copy and paste it in, change the path, and you've got yourself the once library. And let's see, how could we get jQuery updates? Another question, how could we get jQuery updates if jQuery is removed and we fork it? It would be great to keep up with new releases. I doubt forking is going to be the approach we go with. I think custom builds is a possibility, but forking is really something that would only be necessary if it's something that's not maintained, and jQuery is going to be maintained for a pretty long time. So I do like the thought of custom builds where we only provide the jQuery we absolutely need, and the jQuery people, additional jQuery would be available in contributed modules, but the core Drupal package would have a nice lean jQuery. But there's really no reason, there's no reason to fork if we've already got people working on it. Take a look and see if there's any questions we missed. So the only other one let's see. Okay, great. So Nicholas says, you quickly mentioned Ajax. Is the plan to keep it or potentially replace it somehow? So right now it's currently, it sure would be nice if native JavaScript just provides a lot of excellent functionality that wasn't available when we built core Ajax. So it would be nice to get it up to date, but there's also the complexity of gracefully switching it. So there's no urgent need to switch it. And there is an issue that's in the gist linked to that that's beginning that discussion. But it's not clear what we're going to do yet. So let's say it'd be nice if we can live with it for quite a while longer if we have to, but it'd be really great if if we could do our Ajax requests with fetch instead of jQuery and that kind of thing, because now all our supported browsers as of Drupal 10 support fetch. And there's a lot more examples that I just can't remember. And then Scott Sawyer, this concern that is constantly in the back of my mind is, do we run the risk of using libraries with less long-term durability than jQuery? Does a patchwork approach open us up to greater risk? And that is absolutely a concern. And it was one of the reasons that, among the reasons that our approach to the two most complex jQuery UI libraries, Dialog and Autocomplete, wound up just being written by us. Definitely not the only reason. It was hard to find suitable, accessible replacements. But that fear permeates every library I look at. And I think one of the things that I'm hoping will change is that if there's something that really is best accomplished by a library, such as event handling, we would do it in a way that potentially limits how much of that library is considered part of Drupal. So if we do have to switch things out, we don't have to support this sprawling API. It's a lot of work. All right, let's see. So So could you talk about how sites or modules are, Ted asked, could you talk about how sites or modules are warned about JS deprecations? So you, I can't remember, there's a switch that you have to turn on, and then when that switch is on, you'll get console errors when things are used. And I actually would have to confirm if the JavaScript deprecations are in any way covered by the scanning tools, but they're absolutely available as console errors. So I will acknowledge that that is kind of an incomplete answer, and I'd be happy to follow up with anyone on that later. Okay, so Matthew says, can you point us to instructions on introducing NPM dependencies in Drupal 8, how to pull the new JS libraries in? So at the moment, the core's NPM dependencies are dev dependencies, and that's so this would be more of a contrib thing. There's not really an official core way to do it at the moment. So the NPM making once and other packages available as NPM packages at the moment, at least, are largely largely to make these libraries available on non-Drupal sites. And there's an issue that I can dig up where adding this to core functionality is being discussed, and I believe there's even a patch for it. But it would take some looking around for me to find it. So if you'd like me to dig that up, though, find me on Slack, and I'll send it over. All right. So Frank asks, what about writing a Drupal interface for third-party libraries as a way to increase the longevity and allow us to switch out dependencies more easily? I agree, and I think that we may essentially be doing that in some cases. It's kind of on a library by library basis, but I think that if we add a feature-rich library, it is going to be wise to probably limit the amount of features that can be accessed as Drupal features. So we promised a certain feature set, and that interface approach could potentially be one of the things. But we definitely don't want to repeat promising all of jQuery UI to the world, including the parts that we don't use. That created insane overhead, and I like the interface approach. So yeah, that's definitely on the table. All right, so Nicola asks, do you suggest using vanilla JavaScript instead of jQuery even in custom modules? I mean, honestly, it's a matter of preference. The nice thing about using vanilla JavaScript is you're not going to have to worry about any complications that would come from switching to jQuery 4. There are you may run into, if you're heavily interacting with Drupal's JavaScript, particularly events related to dialogues, opening and closing, and others that I can't immediately recall. I may go so far as to actually recommend jQuery, but if you can get by without that dependency, I say go for it. It's there's, in most use cases, vanilla is fine and it's pretty fun, but you may run into a few things if you need jQuery. And actually, if Internet Explorer 11 is still a concern, then you probably still want to go with jQuery until you switch to Drupal 10. So right. And as I don't see any more questions rolling in for a moment, so I want to take a second to share my slides and provide a URL here. Okay, so I'm going to add that to the chat, and then I will also add that to the gist that is in the slides. Let me see if there's anything more in the Q&A. So it looks like I'm going to do one more scan. Okay. So yeah, it looks like the Q&A has completed. On Slack, it's my name, but without, it's my first name, last initial without vowels. So Benjamin M, VNJMNM, you'll figure it out. So you can find me on Slack if you have further questions. And I think that's where we'll finish it then. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm really excited to see people interested in this, in these efforts, and I welcome anybody to jump aboard, review some code, or just present an opinion about what's going on. A lot's happening. So thank you, everybody.